This morning's reading is by Forrest Church, long-arm minister at All Souls in New York City, who died 5 years ago. As he was suffering from cancer of the throat, he wrote the book Love and Death, which a number of us read together earlier in January and February. This is from a chapter called Love, Death, and Easter. If I were to come to church only once a year, I should choose Easter. Easter is a better choice than Christmas. Christmas doesn't have death in it, and it's not in its very center anyway. And if you're going to go to church only once a year, church should have death in it. Christmas does have animals and presents and babies and stars. These are all splendid things. And Christmas has birth, but Easter has death and rebirth. Birth is essential, but for our spiritual journeys, death and rebirth are far more consequential. Easter also has flowers, of course, but flowers don't really have anything to do with Easter. They have to do with spring. I have nothing against flowers. They're almost as splendid as animals, presents, babies, and stars. But Easter is not about flowers. Flowers are beautiful for a brief season and then languish and die just like we do. But then they cast their seeds to the wind, seeds which crack open, springing new life from the husk of death. It's a pretty metaphor. There's only one problem with it. We are not flowers, and Easter is about us. I have no idea whether Jesus was physically resurrected or not, but I suspect he wasn't. If I'm right, for many people, that would be the end of it for Jesus. Period. End of story. Christianity would be a delusion, a miscommunication of events faithfully transmitted from generation to generation for 2,000 years. File it with the Easter Bunny under springtime fantasies. Bequeath it to the Harvard psychologist as a wonderful example of cognitive dissonance. Or to the Jesus Seminar, a flock of New Testament scholars who, after 30 years of deliberation, can find no compelling evidence that the resurrection took place. That this fails to shake my faith is irrelevant, because my faith isn't grounded in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. I ground my faith, my Christian faith, instead in the spiritual rebirth of Jesus' followers, a saving transformation as available to us today as it was to his disciples so very long ago. I'm quite certain that Jesus suffered, thirsted, and felt forsaken in the anguish of his dying hours. I'm equally certain that his followers were devastated when he died. They expected for him to live and save them. But then a miracle took place. Jesus did not live to save them. He died and saved them, which is all the more powerful, however you choose to interpret it. Jesus suffered and wept and died. His followers failed, scattered, wept, found forgiveness, and lived, reborn of his death, children of his undying love. For him and for them, even after death, in his love, Jesus lived on. In his disciples' hearts, he reigned as never before. Everything that mattered about him was theirs now. The way he cast out fear with faith, his love of God and neighbor, his astonishing humility, his disdain for pretense and cant, his courage and his passion. Each was more present now than ever before because Jesus lived within them, not simply among them. That is the essence of the Easter experience. A transformation occurred. Jesus was reborn in the hearts of his followers. Death was the occasion, love the medium, and forgiveness the catalyst. Reverend Nate Barnhouse tells the story of how the worship committee of the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Honey Springs got together to plan their Easter service. One of the members of the committee reminds them that Easter derives from Ostera, the Saxon goddess of the spring, and in celebration of the coming spring, their traditional holiday was celebrated with egg hunts at dawn on the day of the equinox. Rabbits were also sacred to Ostera. Another member objects, saying that Easter is about Jesus, and it's about time that the congregation allowed his name to be used on occasions other than when the minister stubs his toe. Another despairing of these diametrically opposed views, just have a flower communion and have done with it. Another tells of how the Longawi people, with whom she lived as an anthropologist, celebrated their own rituals of fertility when the river flooded with a nice stew of rabbit with a few fire ants mixed in for a little zing. When the minister finally spoke up, he said, "Easter is about resurrection." "Yes," replied the austere advocate, "new life, green shoots, bulbs." The resurrection of Jesus. A particular resurrection, continued the minister. "You don't really believe that literally, do you?" the humanist said. The Christian jumped in, "Well, he was dead and now he's alive in our hearts. The Christ principle is the engine of love and compassion in the world, and love can't be destroyed. That's what it means to me." "So love lives on," the minister said. "Yes," the Christian replied, love itself can't be destroyed. It emerges like a green weed from the tiniest crack in the cement, and if there isn't a crack, it makes one. Love itself, the minister repeated. Realizing that it was now his turn to try and integrate these divergent strands, he sighed. "Listen," he said, "I'm just a plain old middle-of-the-road Unitarian Universalist. I think the human spirit is magnificent, and science is a great way to think about the world. It has its limitations, though, and I'm comfortable with the idea of mystery, even mystery that may never be understood. The teachings of Rabbi Jesus are fine with me, especially the Sermon on the Mount, which, if it were all the scripture we had, would be plenty to go on for an entire life. I feel connected with nature, and I think human beings live more richly when they learn how the earth works, when they dance by bonfires at night, when they have a sense of awe at the wonders that inhabit this planet and beyond. I do not think that nature is sweet, nice, benevolent, or motherly, though. You'd have to stay indoors your whole life to believe that. So you want to do something about love's power to create new life," he continued meekly. "That would be wonderful, everyone agreed." Reverend Earl Holt, my mentor during my first years in ministry, was then the minister at King's Chapel in Boston, our Unitarian Episcopalian congregation. He used to tell me that Unitarian Universalist ministers offered one of two sermons on Easter: "Jesus Christ is risen today," or "Upsy-daisy." Now, I have to confess that Upsy-daisy has its attractions. Easter is a holiday ideally suited for spring. The original events occurred around Passover, which is in fact a spring festival as well as a festival of liberation. But as Christianity spread, Easter took on the trappings of many other ancient spring celebrations as well. In spring, life returns, flowers bloom, we all emerge from our winter caves and heavy coats to greet the spring's glorious sun another year. Lo, the earth awakes again, Alleluia. Wake up, look, pay attention. Something extraordinary is happening. And Earth Day comes this Tuesday. It's a good time to contemplate our Mother Gaia and all her beauty and fragility. It's a time to think about the recent depressing report from the International Panel on Climate Change, which identifies changes already underway as a result of our impact on the atmosphere, and warns of more severe changes if nothing is done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions going forward. Wake up! Look out! Pay attention! Care tenderly for this fragile web of life of which we are only a tiny part. Yes, Upsy-daisy needs attention. Besides, nobody criticizes you for using the J word if you preach Upsy-daisy. But there's also another story of Easter, and it's also about waking up, looking, paying attention. That was what happened to the followers of Jesus as they experienced something after the despair of the crucifixion. They remembered stories of how Jesus had told about seeds falling into the earth and dying in order to come back as new life. And they came to believe that something like that was true of Jesus as well. Now, the Easter story is told in a different way in each of the 4 Gospels that recount the stories, each leading inevitably to the climax during Holy Week, which we're just now at the end of. For example, the 7 last words that Jesus is said to have spoken from the cross are drawn from all 4 of the Gospels, 3 from the Gospel of Luke, 3 from the Gospel of John, and 1 that appears both in Matthew and in Mark. So, like the Christmas story, we're putting together different strands of stories to make a single story out of them. And it's pretty clear that the story only came into focus over a period of time as the disciples got together and shared their different stories and experiences and memories and built up a more consistent picture. We can see this happening in the progression of the Gospels. Mark was probably written first about 40 years after Jesus was crucified, and then probably Matthew, Luke, and John followed at intervals of a decade or so. Mark, the earliest gospel that was written down, tells the story of Easter morning in just 8 verses. The first 4 tell how Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Salome came to the tomb worrying about how they would roll away the gigantic stone at the entrance. But it had already been rolled back when they got there. And then the story goes on in the 5th verse. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's been raised. He's not here. Look, there's the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's it. That's the end of the story as it was first written down. No body, no appearance of the risen Jesus, the women fleeing in terror and telling no one. Then as the story got elaborated, resurrection appearances were added in the other Gospels, and eventually somebody wrote some additional verses in Mark, which became alternate endings. But the first version ends abruptly in terror without a resurrection appearance. One of the most interesting stories that I focus on is the story of how several disciples were traveling from Jerusalem to Emmaus when a stranger fell in with them. They told him of their despair, and he proceeded to provide them with a framework drawn from the Hebrew Bible to explain why the crucifixion actually held promise and not defeat. The disciples were amazed at this stranger's wisdom, and they didn't know who he was. They didn't recognize him until they all sat down for dinner that evening, and Jesus spoke words of blessing over the bread, and it suddenly disappeared. I think this story is kind of a parable about how the disciples over time on their journey figured out what to make of the death of Jesus and what it meant for them. And they told each other, "Wake up, look, pay attention, something amazing has happened." The ideas that came to make up this shared narrative of what the life and especially the death and last days of Jesus meant were commonplace at the time. Were questioned by the Romans and the quislings at the temple in their midst, excited hopes of a Messiah who would liberate the people and the land, and a number of men before Jesus and after claimed to be the Messiah only to be cut down by the Romans and their allies. The popular expectation was a Messiah who would come, conquer their enemies, and liberate the land, a military ruler like King David of old. So a slight adjustment was needed to account for a different kind of Messiah, a liberator without conquest who promised a different kind of kingdom. The notion that such a liberator might be a son of God was also not unheard of. In fact, the Emperor Augustus claimed the title son of a god when his father, his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, was declared a deity by the Senate in Rome. And because the conquest of most of the known world under Augustus had brought about an clemency and repressive peace, Augustus was also proclaimed to be a Prince of Peace, another title that was adopted for Jesus. The idea that those who were faithful to their Jewish religion would be resurrected at the ends of time became prominent during the persecution of Jews by the Greek king Antiochus 160 years before Jesus was born. That belief, the belief that ultimately they would go to heaven and be resurrected, was something that enabled those who resisted persecution and torture rather than give up their faith to endure martyrdom. And their devotion was validated by the miracle of the oil lamp that burned in the temple for 8 days with a supply of only 1 day of oil, a miracle that's told every year at Hanukkah. Of course, crucifixion was the execution of choice for rebels who rose against the Roman Empire. When Spartacus led a slave revolt against the Romans 100 years before Jesus was crucified, 6,000 rebels were crucified along the Appian Way. And during the Jewish revolt 40 years after Jesus died, all of the trees for miles around Jerusalem were cut down to make crosses for the rebels. In truth, Jesus probably suffered less than tens of thousands of others who shared his fate. So the elements of the narrative that made up the Easter story were available to the disciples when they tried to explain to themselves what had happened, though it probably took some years before all the pieces were put together and make up the story that is remembered today. And that story, the road to Emmaus, gives some clues about how it developed over time and became shaped, and how an apparent defeat was actually a great victory. And from their belief and understanding, they launched a religion that was ultimately adopted by the Roman Empire itself some 300 years later, and that lives on to this day. It's hard to know what to make of these stories. I've been struggling with them for a long time, coming from a background of people who literally believe the story. I can't say I've come up with any good ways of teasing out the truth behind them. I'd like to reduce this set of reports to an hour-long police procedural on TV. I'd like to see some of those canny cops separating the witnesses and getting each of their stories down on paper, noting the many discrepancies and asking clever questions like, how many people do you claim came to the empty tomb? Exactly who were they? How did you know it was him? Why did it take you so long to recognize him? What did he look like exactly? We know some of you are lying. And of course, I'd like the mystery to be resolved by the end of the hour so I could lay down my own questions and move on to other stories. Unfortunately, life doesn't unfold quite the way a police procedural does. We're always making judgments without having all the information we need in front of us. We fall in love with someone without knowing that they love us in return as much as we love them. We have children, not knowing how their story will unfold, not knowing how hard or easy their lives may be, not knowing what changes they will force on us as their parents. We make decisions every day without knowing for sure, just going on faith that we're right to choose one course of action rather than another. Maybe unfortunately we live in the shadow of the Enlightenment. We wish we could be certain about what is true and what is false, what stories really happen, and if they happen exactly the way that they're told. We wish we could prove beyond a shadow of doubt exactly what really happened and exactly how we should respond to whatever it was. But here's the thing. None of us ever gets all the evidence before we have to decide how to live our lives. None of what makes us human is reducible to fixed laws that help to explain the orbits of the planets. Somehow we have to make decisions whose results can't be predicted with precision. Human beings aren't reducible to equations, alas, and thank heavens. We do know one thing for certain. The disciples and the others who followed Jesus put aside their despair, their sense of hopelessness, their grief, and they began spreading the word about the kingdom of heaven. These simple folk became so brave that they could speak before great crowds and pass on the good news even at the risk of their own lives. There was something about this message that made them even willing to risk martyrdom. And the strength of their convictions convinced others to join them. One of the early leaders of the church said that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church, that it was precisely their willingness to accept even death that made others so certain that they must be right. And all of this was inspired by the story of how Jesus had been resurrected. 4 years ago, I suffered a very mild stroke just before Easter Sunday. It was nothing serious. It was a numbness all up and down my right side, and there were no residual effects. So this having occurred 3 days before Easter, I was able to come back and participate in the service. But I asked my good friend Robbie Walsh, the minister emeritus of our congregation in Duxbury, to give the sermon. Robbie told the story of how he'd been getting his teeth cleaned not long before Easter Sunday. The dental hygienist chose the moment when his mouth was full of instruments to say, "You're a Unitarian Universalist, right? You don't believe in the resurrection, do you?" As so often happens when we're confronted with an unexpected comment, Robbie was left without the right words to say, even if he had been able to talk while his mouth was being probed aggressively by the dental hygienist. And it took him a few days to recount to himself the many ways we do believe in resurrection. We see it all around us as life returns to the earth after the winter. We see it in the lives of others and of ourselves when despair is replaced by hope, when mourning gives way and we are comforted, when love overcomes hate. I could have said on that morning that I've been reminded of how fragile my life is and how I was now returned to life after a brush with my own mortality. That wasn't an entirely rational feeling, and it certainly was not a resurrection, but it was an occasion for rejoicing. Wake up. Look. Pay attention. Something wonderful is happening. Easter is our opportunity to remember that there's resurrection all around us. We experience it as the earth awakens to new life in the spring. We see it in the faith that even the most brutal of tyrants cannot prevail forever. The hope for liberation remaining alive in the midst of great oppression. We see it in our lives when despair gives way to hope. When grief abates, when a brush with mortality reminds us how precious life is and how we must use it wisely. Easter is a reminder, too, that we can make a difference in the world, that we, too, can help to heal the world when we feed the hungry, care for those who are ill, comfort those who mourn, and pass it on. There are miracles all around us if only we could see them. You don't have to be a literalist to recognize that something extraordinary happened that first Easter morning so long ago. The disciples put together what they knew of Jesus and told the story over and over to everyone they met. Stephen Schick, now minister emeritus of the Unitarian Church of Marlborough and Hudson, puts it this way in his meditation: consider the lilies. It's not newness we seek, but the fresh return of the eternal. He said, the truth is not hidden in mountains. It's not far off. It's in your hand, your heart, your mouth. So do it, he said. He spoke in parables, mostly about money and the truth that money can't buy. Consider the mustard seed, he said, how it grows into the largest shrub. From it, he said, know your true wealth and power. Consider the birds that nest in the shrub, he said, how they sing in the spring. From them, he said, know your true heart's song. Consider the lilies, he said, and don't worry. The truth is at hand. With the seed and the lilies, nothing new arrives. Even the mockingbird sings songs that other birds once knew. Nothing arrives with newness. All is waiting to be reborn. And so for us, in the blooming of the flowers, we celebrate new life. In the birth of many creatures, we celebrate new life. Remembering resurrection, we celebrate new life. So may it be.